My name is Rebecca, and at 33 years old, I walked through my front door bleeding through my bandages after an emergency surgery. I was barely standing yet. The first thing my sister did was demand I cook dinner for her husband. She told me to quit faking my pain, claiming she deserved a hot meal since she was my legally registered state-funded caregiver. What she did not know was that the tall, serious man standing silently right behind me was not a nurse. He was an investigator for the State Department of Insurance Fraud. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had a toxic family member try to exploit you. The ride home from the hospital had been absolute agony. Every single bump in the road pulled violently at the fresh stitches in my abdomen. I had undergone an emergency appendectomy just 48 hours prior. The hospital staff had urged me to stay another night for observation, but the sterile environment and the constant beeping of machines made it impossible to rest. I just wanted to go home. I wanted to crawl into my own bed in the house that I had worked so hard to purchase. Every step up the concrete driveway felt like a marathon. The surgical tape pulled tightly against my skin, and I could feel a warm dampness spreading under the thick gauze. I knew I was bleeding. I knew I needed to lie down immediately. The afternoon sun beat down on my shoulders, but I felt freezing cold from the physical shock still lingering in my system. The doctors had told me I was lucky my appendix had not completely ruptured, but luck was the absolute last thing I felt. I pulled my house key from the lock, my hand trembling slightly as a fresh wave of nausea washed over me. I leaned my weight against the heavy oak door and pushed it open. I was expecting a quiet house. I was hoping for a single moment of peace to simply catch my breath and take my prescribed pain medication. Instead, the moment I stepped into my own foyer, the sharp, annoyed voice of my 30-year-old sister Cassidy echoed loudly from the living room. "Nice of you to finally come home," she snapped, not even bothering to look up from her glowing smartphone screen. "Quit faking it and get dinner on the table this second. Jamal is starving and you are ruining our evening." I stood frozen in the entryway, clutching my bandaged stomach. My mind struggled to process the sheer audacity of her welcome. I slowly turned my head and looked through the wide archway. There was Cassidy lounging casually on my expensive custom leather sofa. She was not just relaxing. She was surrounded by an absolute mountain of high-end shopping bags. The glossy logos of luxury department stores, boutique clothing shops, and expensive cosmetic brands completely covered my solid wood coffee table. Crisp tissue paper was scattered carelessly across the rug. She had clearly spent the entire afternoon on a massive shopping spree while I was lying in a hospital bed recovering from major surgery. I took a slow, painful breath, trying to steady myself against the hallway wall. The stitches pulled sharply, warning me not to move too fast. Cassidy let out a loud, dramatic sigh when I did not immediately head for the kitchen. She finally shifted her weight on the couch, tossing her perfectly styled blonde hair over her shoulder. She continued her rant without an ounce of empathy. "I do not know why you are just standing there looking miserable," she complained, her voice dripping with pure entitlement. "I do so much for you around here. I am legally your registered caregiver, you know. I had to fill out all those complicated state forms and everything. The least you can do is make sure my husband has a hot meal waiting for him after he has had such a stressful day sitting around the house." The absolute nerve of her words felt like a physical slap across the face. She had not visited me a single time in the hospital. She had not sent a brief text message to ask if I had survived the operation. Her only concern was her own convenience and feeding her unemployed husband. But what disgusted me the most was her casual, arrogant mention of being my caregiver. For the past 18 months, Cassidy had been secretly collecting a massive state-funded check, claiming she was providing full-time medical care for a severely disabled family member. She had stolen my identity and used my past medical history to commit blatant insurance fraud. She was using taxpayer money to fund her luxury lifestyle, while living completely rent-free in my guest wing. I did not yell at her. I did not break down and cry. I simply shifted my weight, stepping slightly to the side, to reveal the person who had quietly followed me inside the house. Cassidy rolled her eyes heavily and finally looked up from her phone to glare at me. But the cruel insult she was about to deliver died instantly in her throat. She froze completely rigid. Her perfectly manicured fingers went slack, and her expensive smartphone slipped from her grasp, dropping right onto the hardwood floor with a loud clatter. She was no longer looking at my pale, exhausted face. She was staring wide-eyed at the tall, incredibly serious man in a dark, tailored suit, standing completely silent right behind my shoulder. The man did not blink as Cassidy stared at him in absolute horror. He stepped forward, moving past me with a cold, authoritative presence that instantly changed the entire atmosphere of the room. He reached into his suit jacket pocket and pulled out a black leather wallet, flipping it open to reveal a gleaming silver federal badge. "Are you Cassidy Reynolds?" he asked. His voice was low, steady, and completely devoid of any emotion. Cassidy swallowed hard, her eyes darting frantically between the shiny badge and my face. "I am," she whispered. Her voice had suddenly lost all of its previous arrogant bite. "Who are you?" "I am Special Agent Donovan with the State Department of Insurance Fraud," he replied smoothly. "I am looking for the individual claiming $4,500 a month in state caregiver compensation for the supposedly disabled resident of this address." All the color instantly drained from Cassidy's face. The bright flush pink of her cheeks vanished, leaving her looking pale and sickly white. She looked down at the massive pile of luxury shopping bags surrounding her on the sofa, suddenly realizing exactly how incriminating the scene looked. The designer leather shoes, the expensive makeup palettes, the high-end dresses. All of it had been purchased with stolen government funds, and the man who caught her was standing right in her living room. She began to stammer uncontrollably, her hands shaking as she tried to form a coherent sentence. "Wait, there must be some kind of huge mistake," she pleaded. Her voice pitched an octave higher in absolute panic. "It is just a minor paperwork error. My mother helped me fill out those confusing forms. I did not really understand what I was signing. I do take care of my sister. She is sick right now. You can see she just got home from the hospital. I am doing my job." Agent Donovan did not buy a single word of her pathetic, stuttering performance. He pulled a small black notepad from his chest pocket and flipped it open completely, ignoring her frantic backpedaling. "A paperwork error does not explain 18 consecutive months of cashed government checks deposited directly into your personal bank account, Miss Reynolds. Furthermore, medical and employment records clearly indicate that the resident of this house was fully employed, working 50 hours a week, and absolutely not requiring state-assisted care when this fraudulent application was filed and approved." Cassidy was full-on hyperventilating now. She jumped up from the leather sofa, pointing a shaking finger directly at me. "Rebecca, tell him," she screamed. She completely abandoned her fragile victim act and reverted straight back to her usual vicious self. "Tell your attack dog to back off right now. Tell him I help you around the house and do your chores. You cannot do this to me. I am your flesh and blood sister." I stood my ground, keeping my hand pressed firmly against my bleeding side. "You are not my caregiver, Cassidy," I said quietly but firmly. "You are a fraud. And you are going to answer for every single cent you stole using my name." Agent Donovan closed his notepad with a sharp snap and looked Cassidy dead in the eye. He began reading her rights in a clear, unwavering tone that echoed through the quiet house. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The severe reality of the situation finally crashed down on Cassidy like a ton of bricks. She was not going to talk her way out of this one. Her superficial charm, her fake tears, and her lifelong status as the golden child of our family meant absolutely nothing to a seasoned federal fraud investigator. She began to sob hysterically, burying her face in her hands and sinking back down onto the sofa, right on top of a crushed designer shopping bag. She begged me to make it stop, promising she would pay all the money back. She promised she would cook dinner every single night and clean the floors if I just made the scary man go away. I watched her cry and felt absolutely nothing. This was the same woman who had mocked me my entire life. When I was studying late into the night to build my forensic accounting firm, she was out partying on our mother's dime. When I finally bought this beautiful 5-bedroom home in a quiet upscale neighborhood, she manipulated our mother into forcing me to let her move in. She claimed she and Jamal just needed a few months to get on their feet after his tech startup failed miserably. A few months quickly turned into 8 long, agonizing months of them treating my home like a luxury hotel where they were the VIP guests and I was the unpaid maid. They took over the entire guest wing. They blasted loud music at all hours. They left dirty dishes piled high in my custom marble sink. And the whole time she was cashing massive state checks meant for the disabled just to buy another designer handbag she did not need. I had endured her disrespect because I was too exhausted from building my business to fight back. But laying in that hospital bed facing a medical emergency entirely alone had changed something deep inside me. I realized that keeping the peace with toxic people only meant I was going to war with myself, and I was done being a casualty in my own life. I felt a cold, dark sense of satisfaction wash over me, momentarily numbing the sharp, agonizing ache of my surgical wounds. For years, she had taken everything from me. She took my personal space, my peace of mind, and finally my legal identity, all to selfishly fund her own desires. Now, the massive bill had finally come due. But the chaotic confrontation was far from over. Just as Agent Donovan reached around to his heavy leather belt to pull out a pair of steel handcuffs, heavy aggressive footsteps echoed loudly from the wooden staircase out in the hallway. "Hey, what is all that screaming down there?" a deep, angry voice bellowed. It was Jamal, Cassidy's charismatic but fiercely aggressive and deeply in debt husband. He stormed down the stairs, his large, imposing frame completely filling the hallway archway as he took in the bizarre scene. He saw his wife crying hysterically on the couch, surrounded by her ruined shopping bags, and a strange, unfamiliar man in a sharp suit standing over her with handcuffs ready. Jamal's face twisted into a dark mask of pure rage. He puffed out his chest and took a heavy step squarely into the living room, ready to use his physical size to intimidate whoever dared to upset his precious wife. "Who the hell are you?" Jamal yelled, pointing an aggressive finger straight at Agent Donovan. "And what exactly do you think you are doing in my house? Get out of here before I call the cops and throw you out myself." Jamal stepped off the bottom stair and moved directly into the center of the living room. He was a tall, broadly built man who was completely used to getting his way just by taking up space and raising his voice. He wore designer sweatpants and a premium-fitted graphic tee, looking like a man who spent his days lounging rather than working. He puffed out his chest and marched straight up to Agent Donovan, invading his personal space. "You have no warrant," Jamal barked, his voice booming off the high ceilings of the living room. "I know my rights, man. You cannot just walk into my property and start harassing my wife. Get out of my house before I call the cops on you for trespassing." Agent Donovan did not flinch. He did not step back. He simply looked Jamal up and down with the calm, analytical gaze of a man who dealt with aggressive fraudsters every single day of his career. He kept his hands loosely at his sides, completely unimpressed by Jamal and his loud posturing. He knew exactly how to handle men who tried to use their physical size to cover up their crimes. "Your property?" Agent Donovan asked, his voice quiet, but carrying a sharp edge of authority. "That is an interesting claim." I watched Jamal try to physically dominate the room while Cassidy continued to sob softly on the sofa. Even through the hazy fog of my prescription pain medication, I could see exactly what Jamal was trying to do. He was trying to take control of the narrative. He was trying to act like the protective man of the house, defending his fragile wife from an unprovoked attack. It was the exact same manipulative performance he used on our mother to get whatever he wanted out of her bank account. I took a slow, shallow breath to brace my core against the stinging pain of my surgical incision. I did not yell back at him. I did not match his frantic, angry energy. Yelling took too much physical effort, and frankly, I did not need to raise my voice to destroy his ridiculous illusion. The truth was going to be loud enough on its own. I carefully reached down and pulled my dark canvas hospital bag onto the kitchen island. The heavy canvas dragged across the smooth marble countertop, making a soft scraping sound that briefly cut through Jamal in his loud ranting. I unzipped the main compartment. My hands were still slightly pale and shaky from the blood loss and the anesthesia, but my movements were entirely deliberate. I bypassed my folded hospital gowns and my prescription bottles. I reached into the flat back pocket of the bag and pulled out a crisp, thick manila folder. I had asked my estate lawyer to prepare these documents weeks ago, but the sudden rupture of my appendix had delayed my plan. Now the timing was absolutely perfect. "Your property, Jamal," I asked. My voice was raspy from the breathing tube they used during my surgery, but the words rang out loud and clear in the quiet kitchen. Jamal whipped his head around to glare at me. "Shut up, Rebecca," he snapped, pointing a thick finger in my direction. "I am handling this guy. You just sit down and stay out of it before you make things worse for yourself." I ignored his command. I opened the manila folder and pulled out a stack of heavy watermarked paper with thick blue notary stamps on the bottom of every single page. I placed my hand flat on the top document and slid it forcefully across the polished marble island. The crisp paper glided perfectly across the smooth surface and stopped exactly right in front of where Jamal was standing. "I paid off this entire mortgage 3 years ago," I said, staring directly into his angry eyes. "Every single brick of this 5-bedroom house belongs exclusively to me. My name is the only name on that official property deed. You and Cassidy have been squatting in my guest wing for 8 months." Jamal looked down at the official deed resting on the marble counter. His jaw tightened, but he refused to pick it up. He knew what it was. "You are only living under my roof because you blew through $200,000 of your seed funding for your tech startup." I continued, not letting him interrupt me. "You told your angel investors you were building a revolutionary financial app, but instead, you bought a luxury SUV, you bought custom-tailored suits, and you funded Cassidy and her endless shopping sprees. You two are not successful homeowners. You are broke, unemployed house guests who have completely overstayed your welcome." Agent Donovan glanced down at the deed and then looked back up at Jamal, raising one eyebrow slightly. It seemed Jamal did not own the house after all. For a brief second, I actually thought Jamal might feel a sense of shame. I thought the public embarrassment of having his massive financial failure exposed right in front of a federal agent might finally puncture his massive ego. I thought he would realize that his loud, aggressive act had completely fallen apart and that he had absolutely no power in this situation. Any normal person would have felt humiliated being called out for taking advantage of a sick relative. But I severely underestimated the sheer entitlement of my brother-in-law. Jamal did not apologize. He did not look embarrassed. Instead, the angry defensive posture completely vanished and was instantly replaced by a cold, mocking sneer. He let out a loud, arrogant laugh that echoed through the kitchen. He walked over and leaned his elbows casually against the marble island right on top of my official property deed. He looked at me with a sickeningly triumphant smile. "You think you are so smart, Rebecca?" he chuckled, shaking his head as if I was a foolish child. "You think just because your name is on some piece of paper that you can just toss us out onto the street? You really do not know how the real world works, do you?" I felt a cold knot form in my stomach despite the warm sunlight streaming through the windows. "What are you talking about?" I asked, my voice tightening. "You cannot kick us out anyway." Jamal sneered, his eyes gleaming with malicious satisfaction. "We have squatter rights in this state. We have been living here, receiving our mail here, and using this address as our primary legal residence for more than 6 months. By law, you have to give us a formal written eviction notice and take us through a lengthy court process, which could take over a year. Good luck trying to get a judge to kick out a pregnant woman." He paused, letting the legal threat hang in the heavy air before delivering his final, devastating blow. "And besides that, we are not just squatters," he added, his smile growing even wider. "We are legal tenants. We have a signed residential lease agreement for the guest wing. And since you were so busy working all the time, your mother graciously stepped in as your designated property manager and co-signed our lease agreement on your behalf. You cannot touch us, Rebecca. This is our home now." Jamal crossed his thick arms firmly over his chest, looking incredibly smug. He honestly believed he had just played the ultimate trump card. He stood right in the middle of my kitchen, acting like a legal genius who had just trapped me in my own home. He thought he had found the perfect loophole using state tenant laws to secure a free luxury residence for himself and his wife. He had that arrogant smirk plastered across his face, the kind of look a schoolyard bully gives you when they know a teacher is not watching. He leaned heavily against the polished marble island, tapping his fingers casually, right next to my official property deed. He was entirely convinced that because our mother had gone behind my back and signed a piece of paper, he was completely untouchable. He probably thought I was just a naive woman who did not understand complex property laws or eviction moratoriums. I did not scream at him. I did not throw a furious fit or bang my fists on the counter. The sharp, stinging pain in my lower abdomen was a constant physical reminder to stay completely composed. Every time I breathed too deeply, the surgical stitches pulled tightly against my skin. I let his arrogant, mocking laughter slowly fade into the heavy quiet of the room. I just stood there, leaning slightly against the doorway for support, and looked at him. Then I smiled. It was a very tired, painful smile, but it was completely genuine. I felt a deep, profound sense of calm wash over me, because I knew exactly what was about to happen next. "You really think I do not read my own mail, Jamal?" I asked softly, my voice steady despite my exhaustion. "I am a professional forensic accountant. My entire career is built on finding hidden money and exposing fraudulent documents. I do not miss a single piece of paper that comes into this house." Jamal frowned slightly, his smug smile faltering just a fraction of an inch. "I know Mom signed a fake residential lease for you," I continued, keeping my eyes locked dead onto his. "I found the forged carbon copy stuffed in her desk drawer 3 weeks ago when I was looking for a spare house key. She signed her own name, listing herself as the authorized property manager of a home she does not own, and has never contributed a single mortgage payment toward. She had absolutely no legal authority to grant you residency here. And using a forged document to establish a fake tenancy while simultaneously collecting fraudulent state caregiver funds does not give you squatter rights, it gives you a second felony charge." Jamal opened his mouth to argue, to yell another aggressive threat, but the words never made it out of his throat. "That is exactly why Agent Donovan did not come here alone," I said. Right on cue, the entire atmosphere in the living room violently shifted. Through the large custom bay windows facing the quiet suburban street, bright strobing flashes of red and blue light suddenly illuminated the pale walls. The brilliant flashing colors bounced wildly off the crystal chandelier hanging from the ceiling and reflected off the glossy luxury shopping bags scattered all across the leather sofa. 2 fully marked police cruisers had quietly rolled up my long concrete driveway without their sirens on. The heavy, unmistakable sound of heavy car doors slamming shut echoed loudly through the perfectly manicured front yard. Jamal froze completely solid. His smug, mocking smile vanished instantly, completely wiped from his face, as if it had never been there at all. His thick arms dropped limply to his sides, and his shoulders slumped. The false bravado, the aggressive posturing, and the arrogant confidence he had built up just seconds ago completely evaporated into thin air. He took a slow, terrified step back from the kitchen island, his eyes darting frantically toward the front door. He suddenly looked very small. Cassidy let out a sharp, high-pitched gasp. She scrambled backward on the sofa, kicking a designer shoebox onto the floor. She started hyperventilating again, clutching her chest and pulling her knees up to her chin as she watched the silhouettes of uniformed police officers walking aggressively up the front pathway. The reality of the situation was finally sinking in. This was not a family argument they could manipulate their way out of. This was a federal criminal investigation, and the authorities were literally at the front door. Agent Donovan finally spoke up, breaking the tense, panicked silence in the room. He adjusted his suit jacket and looked at Jamal with an expression of pure professional indifference. "A fraudulent lease document utilized to facilitate state insurance theft does not grant you civil tenant protections," Agent Donovan explained calmly. This property is now an active crime scene regarding the seizure of assets purchased with stolen government funds. The local authorities are here to assist in executing those seizure warrants and to ensure the lawful removal of all unauthorized individuals from the premises. The heavy sound of tactical boots stepping onto the wooden planks of my front porch sent another wave of visible panic right through Cassidy. She began crying hysterically, burying her face in her hands and begging Jamal to do something. But just as the uniformed officers raised their hands to knock on the front door, a sudden violent screech of rubber tires tore aggressively through the quiet neighborhood street. A large silver sedan came flying around the corner, entirely ignoring the speed limit. It jumped the concrete curb and tore straight across my perfectly manicured green front lawn. The heavy car ripped up large chunks of expensive grass and dirt before slamming hard on the brakes, stopping just mere inches away from the rear bumper of the parked police cruisers. The driver's side door flew open violently before the engine was even completely turned off. It was my mother, Brenda. She scrambled out of the vehicle, leaving her expensive purse sitting on the driver's seat, and practically sprinted toward my front porch. Her face was flushed bright red with a mixture of absolute fury and utter panic. She completely ignored the flashing police lights and shoved her way right past the two bewildered uniformed officers standing on the steps. She threw open my unlocked front door with incredible force, slamming the heavy wood against the entryway wall. She burst into the foyer like a chaotic hurricane, screaming my name at the top of her lungs, ready to completely destroy me for daring to hold her precious golden child accountable. The heavy oak front door slammed against the interior wall with a deafening crack that shook the entire hallway. My mother, Brenda, charged into the house like an absolute force of nature. She was dressed in her pristine white tennis outfit, having clearly rushed straight from her exclusive country club the exact moment Cassidy called her in a blind panic. She did not even pause to acknowledge the two fully uniformed police officers standing right on my front porch. She did not ask what was happening or if anyone was actually hurt. Her eyes darted wildly around the room, completely ignoring my pale face and my hunched posture, until she locked onto the sight of Cassidy crying on the sofa. She moved with a frantic, desperate energy that she only ever displayed when her precious golden child was experiencing even the slightest bit of discomfort. As she rushed past me in the narrow entryway, she did not slow down. She did not politely ask me to step aside. She forcefully shoved her shoulder hard against my chest to get past me faster. The sudden violent impact hit me squarely on my right side, right where the fresh surgical stitches held my abdomen together. A blinding flash of searing white-hot pain ripped through my body, taking my breath away instantly. I stumbled backward, hitting my shoulder hard against the hallway wall, as a fresh wave of warm blood instantly soaked through my thick hospital gauze bandages. My mother did not even look back to see if I had fallen. She did not care that her eldest daughter, who had just been released from the hospital mere hours ago, was now leaning against the wall, trembling in agonizing physical pain. Her entire universe revolved entirely around Cassidy. She threw herself onto the luxury leather sofa, wrapping her arms protectively around my fully grown 30-year-old sister, pulling her tightly against her chest. She began smoothing perfectly styled blonde hair and rocking her back and forth, whispering soothing words, as if Cassidy had just been the victim of a violent home invasion. Cassidy immediately leaned into the dramatic performance. She buried her face in our mother's expensive tennis sweater, sobbing loudly and pointing a trembling finger across the room at me. She whined that I was trying to ruin her life and that I had brought strange, scary men into the house to take her away. That was all the prompting my mother needed. Brenda slowly turned her head and glared at me with a look of pure, unfiltered hatred. The protective, motherly warmth she had just shown Cassidy vanished instantly, replaced by a cold, vicious rage. She stood up from the sofa, her fists clenched tightly at her sides. "Have you completely lost your mind, Rebecca?" she screamed, her voice echoing shrilly off the high ceilings. "How dare you bring law enforcement into this house? How dare you drag a private family matter out into the open for the entire neighborhood to see? We solve our problems behind closed doors like a respectable family. We do not call the cops on our own flesh and blood." I pressed my hand firmly against my bleeding side, trying to take short, shallow breaths to manage the intense, throbbing pain. A private family matter? I whispered, my voice shaking slightly from the physical trauma. She stole my identity, Mom. She committed federal insurance fraud using my medical records. That is not a private family matter. That is a major felony. My mother aggressively waved her hand in the air, completely dismissing my words as if I was just complaining about a borrowed sweater. I do not want to hear your dramatic exaggerations, she snapped, taking a heavy step toward me. Your sister made a simple mistake with some state paperwork. It is nothing we could not have fixed quietly with a small fine and a good lawyer. But no, you had to go and escalate things because you have always been so incredibly jealous of her. You just could not stand to see her happily married and building a life for herself. She then turned her attention to Jamal, who had visibly relaxed the moment she entered the room. He was standing near the kitchen island, once again looking like a smug, innocent victim. My mother pointed a defensive finger at Agent Donovan. "And how dare you threaten Jamal?" she yelled, her face turning a darker shade of angry red. "He is a good, hard-working black man who is just trying to build a family and get his business off the ground. He has been under so much stress lately and you are treating him like some kind of common criminal. You should be ashamed of yourself, Rebecca. He is your brother-in-law. He is family." The sheer delusion of her words was absolutely staggering. A good, hard-working man. Jamal had not worked a single legitimate day in 8 months. He had taken hundreds of thousands of dollars from innocent investors and completely squandered it on luxury cars and expensive vacations while living rent-free in my house. And yet in my mother's twisted mind, I was the villain for refusing to let them financially bleed me dry. My mother took another aggressive step toward me, towering over my injured, hunched form. She decided it was time to pull out her favorite weapon, the one supposed failure in my life that she had used to shame me and control me for the past decade. "After everything we did for you," she sneered, her voice dripping with absolute disgust. "After everything we put up with when you dropped out of law school and completely shamed this family in front of all of our friends. We supported you when you were a total failure, Rebecca. We gave you a place to stay when you ruined your own future, and this is how you repay your sister. By calling the cops on her, by trying to throw a pregnant woman out onto the street. You are the most ungrateful, selfish daughter a mother could ever be cursed with." The heavy silence in the room was deafening. Agent Donovan stood perfectly still, watching the entire toxic dynamic unfold with the sharp, observant eyes of a trained investigator. Even the local police officers standing out on the front porch had stopped moving, clearly taken aback by the vicious verbal assault they were witnessing. Jamal crossed his arms, looking incredibly pleased with himself. Cassidy wiped a fake tear from her cheek, hiding a cruel little smirk behind her hands. They all expected me to break. They expected me to lower my head, apologize, and completely submit to my mother's aggressive demands, just like I had always done in the past. They thought the combined weight of my physical injury and her intense emotional manipulation would force me into total compliance. I closed my eyes for a brief second. I felt the warm blood soaking into the waistband of my sweatpants. I felt the sharp, stinging pain of my torn stitches. But beneath all of that physical agony, I felt something else. I felt an incredible, overwhelming sense of absolute clarity. The heavy chain of guilt and obligation that had bound me to this toxic family for 33 years finally snapped. I slowly straightened my posture, fighting through the pain until I was standing completely tall. I lowered my blood-stained hand from my side and looked directly into my mother's furious eyes. My voice was no longer shaking. It was completely calm, completely steady, and ice-cold. "I did not drop out of law school, Mom." I let the words hang in the heavy air of the living room. For 10 years, that had been her favorite weapon against me. 10 years of passive-aggressive comments at holiday dinners. 10 years of her telling her country club friends that her eldest daughter was just trying to find herself after a major academic failure. She loved the narrative that I was the broken one because it made Cassidy look even more perfect by comparison. It was the absolute foundation of our toxic family dynamic. I took a slow, painful breath and pushed myself away from the hallway wall. My hand was still pressing firmly against my bleeding side, but I forced myself to walk forward. Every single step sent a sharp burning sensation right through my lower abdomen, but the adrenaline coursing through my veins kept me moving. I moved slowly toward the heavy solid wood coffee table positioned perfectly right in front of the luxury leather sofa where Cassidy and my mother were sitting. Agent Donovan watched me closely, but he did not intervene. He recognized exactly what was happening. He stepped back slightly, giving me the floor. Sitting right on the edge of the coffee table, completely buried under a discarded pile of crisp tissue paper from Cassidy and her stolen designer shopping spree, was the latest monthly issue of Forbes magazine. It had arrived in the mail 2 days before my appendix ruptured. I reached down and picked up the glossy, heavy magazine. The cover featured a bold headline about young female entrepreneurs redefining the modern financial landscape. I held it in my hand for a brief moment, feeling the smooth, expensive paper beneath my fingertips. Then I tossed it directly onto Cassidy in her lap. The heavy magazine landed with a loud thud right across her knees. Cassidy jumped, slightly startled by the sudden movement. She looked down at the glossy cover, her brow furrowing in deep confusion. My mother immediately leaned over her shoulder, her face still twisted into a mask of pure, furious indignation. She probably thought I was throwing a catalog at them to complain about the mess they had made in my living room. I transferred to forensic accounting. I said, my voice perfectly steady and completely devoid of the emotional breakdown they were both desperately waiting for. I realized that arguing in a courtroom was not nearly as effective as tracking the actual movement of stolen money. Turn to page 42. Cassidy hesitated, her perfectly manicured fingers hovering over the edge of the magazine. She looked up at me, her tear-streaked face suddenly looking very unsure. For the first time in her entire life, she was completely losing control of the narrative, and she could feel it slipping away from her. With a trembling hand, she slowly opened the magazine and flipped through the glossy, thick pages. The sound of paper turning was the absolute only noise in the completely silent room. Even Jamal had stopped shifting his weight in the background, leaning forward slightly out of curiosity. She reached page 42 and stopped dead. The magazine naturally fell open to a massive full-color 2-page spread. Right there in high-definition professional print was a stunning photograph of me. I was standing in front of the massive floor-to-ceiling glass windows of my downtown executive office, wearing a sharp-tailored suit and looking incredibly confident. The bold black headline stretching across the top of the pages read, "The Silent Architect: How Rebecca Built an Elite Financial Empire." The incredibly detailed article chronicled exactly how I had started my own forensic accounting firm entirely from scratch. It detailed my high-profile corporate clients, my relentless work ethic, and my unparalleled success in tracking down hidden corporate assets. But the detail that completely paralyzed both Cassidy and my mother was the large highlighted call-out box right in the center of the page. It clearly estimated my personal net worth at $8.5 million. The room went absolutely dead silent. It was a heavy, suffocating kind of silence, the kind of profound quiet that only happens when someone's entire worldview is violently shattered into a million tiny, unrecoverable pieces. Cassidy stared at the massive numbers printed on the glossy page, her mouth hanging slightly open. She blinked rapidly, as if she believed the ink would suddenly rearrange itself into a mistake. She looked from the magazine up to my pale, exhausted face, and then back down to the magazine again. The disabled, helpless sister she had been stealing state caregiver funds from was a multi-millionaire executive. Over by the kitchen island, I saw Jamal physically react. His eyes went incredibly wide and his jaw dropped. The math was doing cartwheels in his head as he realized the woman he had just threatened with squatter rights could literally buy and sell his entire existence. My mother stopped breathing. I actually watched her chest completely freeze. She grabbed the magazine right out of Cassidy and her hands gripping the edges so tightly her knuckles turned bright white. She pulled the page closer to her face, her eyes frantically scanning the paragraphs. She read about my multi-million-dollar corporate contracts. She read about the massive luxury building I owned downtown. She read the exact financial estimations confirming that the daughter she had constantly labeled a massive failure was actually the wealthiest person her entire family had ever produced. I stood there bleeding quietly and watched her brain completely short-circuit. Any normal parent would have felt a sudden overwhelming rush of pride. Any normal mother would have looked up with tears of joy realizing her child had achieved such incredible monumental success despite all the brutal hardships. Any normal person would have immediately apologized for ever doubting me or calling me a failure. But Brenda was not a normal mother. She was a deeply entrenched narcissist who had just realized that the primary target of her lifelong emotional abuse had secretly held all the ultimate power the entire time. I watched the shock slowly morph right back into something incredibly ugly. The cognitive dissonance was simply too much for her fragile ego to handle. Instead of acknowledging my hard work or expressing any kind of pride, her brain instantly bypassed all logic and headed straight for pure, unfiltered entitlement. She did not see my success as a personal victory. She saw my $8.5 million as a massive pile of money that rightfully belonged to her and her precious golden child. The sheer audacity of what happened next actually made me let out a short, painful laugh. My mother violently slammed the heavy, glossy magazine back down onto the coffee table. The loud smack echoed sharply through the quiet room, causing Jamal to flinch in the background. She stood up, her face contorted with a brand new kind of furious outrage. The absolute shock was completely gone, totally replaced by a sickening, demanding greed. She pointed a sharp, perfectly manicured finger directly at my face. "If you have $8 million," she screamed, her voice vibrating with intense, furious entitlement, "why the hell are you letting your sister suffer like this?" I just stared at her, completely stunned by the flawless mental gymnastics she had just performed. "Pay off her fraud fine right now," my mother demanded, stomping her foot on the expensive rug like a spoiled child throwing a tantrum. "Write a check to the state and make this investigator go away. If you have that kind of money, you can easily buy Jamal a new office space to make up for all this horrible trauma you have put them through today. You have been hiding all this wealth from us, while your pregnant sister struggles. It is your absolute duty as her sister to fix this mess right now." Brenda stood there in her pristine white tennis outfit, pointing her perfectly manicured finger directly at my face. She did not ask me if I could help navigate this nightmare. She did not show a single ounce of concern for the fact that I was standing in my own hallway bleeding through my fresh surgical bandages. Instead, she commanded me to fix the mess, as if I was nothing more than her personal automated teller machine. She told me to pull out my checkbook right this second and pay the state whatever ridiculous fine they wanted to clear Cassidy of all insurance fraud charges. She spoke to Agent Donovan as if he was a minor annoyance holding up her day, demanding to know exactly how much money it would take to make him leave my property immediately. But her absolute entitlement did not stop there. My mother actually had the nerve to demand that I buy Jamal a brand new commercial office space downtown. She looked me dead in the eye and claimed that the intense trauma of having law enforcement in the house had completely derailed his creative energy. She insisted that because I had frightened her pregnant daughter and stressed out her hard-working son-in-law, I owed him a proper luxury workspace to make up for my terrible selfish behavior. I stared at her mouth moving, unable to fully comprehend how a human brain could be this incredibly disconnected from reality. She was looking at a daughter recovering from emergency surgery and demanding a real estate purchase for a man who had been actively living off my stolen identity. A strange sound began to build in the back of my throat. I tried desperately to suppress it because I knew exactly how much it was going to hurt, but I simply could not stop it. I let out a breathless, painful laugh that echoed strangely in the quiet living room. The sudden movement sent a sharp, hot, stabbing pain directly through my fresh abdominal stitches, making my knees buckle slightly. I had to grab the edge of the hallway table just to stay upright. But I kept laughing. The sheer audacity of her demands was actually comical. "Write a check. I whispered, my voice cracking slightly from the dry air and the physical strain. Buy him an office space. I slowly shook my head, looking at the woman who was supposed to protect me. Mom, do you have any idea how many thousands of dollars I have already paid just to keep your own roof over your head? My mother froze instantly. Her eyes darted nervously toward Jamal and Cassidy, who were both watching us closely. She clearly had never told her golden child or her son-in-law the actual truth about her own failing finances. She had always maintained the grand illusion of being a wealthy country club socialite. I decided right then and there that it was time to drag every single skeleton directly out of her closet. For the past 4 years, I have been the one silently paying your property taxes. I said, my voice growing much stronger and colder with every single word. When you were 3 months behind on your mortgage and the bank was actively threatening to foreclose on your house, I was the one who wired $30,000 directly to your lender so you would not get kicked out onto the street. When you took Cassidy on that luxury vacation to the Bahamas last winter, you told everyone it was a generous gift from a wealthy friend. That was my money, Mom. You cried on the phone to me saying you needed emergency help with your medical bills, and then you took my money and bought her designer clothes and tropical cocktails. You have been bleeding me dry for years to fund her lifestyle. I thought the absolute truth would finally silence her. I thought exposing her massive financial lies in front of everyone would force her to finally show some humility, or at least some embarrassment. But you can never underestimate the wild defense mechanisms of a true narcissist. Brenda did not apologize, and she certainly did not thank me for saving her home. Instead, her face twisted into an incredibly ugly mask of pure, unadulterated rage. She took a heavy step toward me, her hands balled into tight, shaking fists. "You are a selfish, greedy sociopath," she screamed, spitting the words at me like venom. "You have millions of dollars sitting in the bank, and you have the absolute nerve to stand there and count every little penny you ever gave your own mother. You do not understand the first thing about family loyalty. We are blood, Rebecca. Money is supposed to be shared in a family. You are just holding this over our heads because you love making us feel small and pathetic." Cassidy immediately sensed the massive shift in the room and realized our mother was rapidly losing the high ground. She knew she had to amplify the drama to keep the heavy heat off her own federal crimes. She let out a loud, tragic wail and threw herself dramatically against Jamal, burying her face in his chest. She cried massive crocodile tears, sobbing so loudly it almost drowned out the sound of the police radios outside on the lawn. She grabbed Jamal by the collar of his shirt, begging him to protect her from me. "Please, Jamal," she cried, her voice shaking with entirely fake terror. "Please do not let her do this to us. She is so incredibly cruel. She hates me because I am married and happy, and she is entirely alone. She is trying to destroy our family and put our baby on the street. You have to stop her, Jamal. Please do something." Jamal wrapped one thick arm around Cassidy, rubbing her back, while glaring at me with a cold, calculating look in his dark eyes. He had been very quiet for the last few minutes, just watching the toxic dynamic unfold between my mother and me. He had fully processed the fact that I was incredibly wealthy, and he realized that screaming angrily at the federal agent was not going to get him what he desperately wanted. He needed leverage, and he needed it fast. Jamal slowly stepped away from Cassidy and reached deep into his sweatpants pocket. He pulled out his expensive smartphone, the exact same one my stolen state funds had paid for, and held it up right in front of his face. The bright screen illuminated the dark, malicious look in his eyes. I immediately noticed the small red recording icon blinking steadily in the top corner of the screen. He adjusted his grip on the phone, making sure the camera lens was pointed directly at my face and the fresh blood soaking through my shirt. He shifted his stance, positioning himself perfectly, so the frame also captured my mother looking distressed, and Cassidy crying hysterically in the background. He was framing the shot to make me look like an unhinged millionaire abusing her poor pregnant sister. His aggressive posture was completely gone, entirely replaced by a chilling, calculated calm. He looked at me over the top of his phone with a sickeningly sweet smile that made my blood run absolutely cold. "You want to play hardball, Rebecca?" he said, his voice totally smooth and incredibly steady. "Let us play." Jamal held his expensive smartphone high in the air, his thick fingers gripping the edges tightly. The bright screen cast a harsh, artificial glow across his smug, confident face. I could clearly see the small red circle blinking steadily in the top right corner, indicating that he had been recording for the last several minutes. He had intentionally waited for my mother to start screaming and for Cassidy to start performing her hysterical crying routine before he hit the record button. He was manipulating the entire scene to fit his twisted narrative. He stepped back slightly, making sure the camera lens captured everything in the perfect context. He angled the phone down to make himself and Cassidy look small and vulnerable while framing me right in the center of the room. He made sure to capture the dark red blood actively seeping through my white shirt to make it look like I had been involved in some kind of violent physical altercation that I had started. He wanted the footage to show a wealthy, unhinged woman towering over her poor crying pregnant sister and her terrified mother. It was a masterclass in modern digital manipulation, and he was extremely proud of his impromptu directing skills. "I am sending this directly to your corporate clients, Rebecca." Jamal said, his voice practically dripping with malicious joy. He kept his eyes glued to the screen, admiring his own camera work. "I know exactly who they are. I saw the client list sitting on your home office desk last month. Massive Fortune 500 companies, conservative investment banks, and high-profile venture capitalists. The kind of people who absolutely hate public relations nightmares." He lowered the phone just a fraction of an inch so he could look me directly in the eyes. His smile was sickeningly sweet, like a predator playing with its food. "I am going to email this video to every single one of your top executives with a very catchy subject line," Jamal sneered. "Millionaire CEO attacks pregnant sister and abuses family. I will post it on every social media platform and tag your elite financial firm. I will send it to the local news stations and tell them the wealthy business owner in their city is a violent sociopath who beats up her disabled sister and kicks her out onto the cold street. How fast do you think your firm goes under when I hit post? How long do you think those rich conservative clients will stay with a forensic accountant who is trending online for domestic abuse?" The room was incredibly quiet except for the sound of Cassidy dramatically sniffling into her hands. My mother stood completely still, watching Jamal with a look of awe and admiration. She actually thought he was brilliant. She thought this unemployed scam artist was a genius for figuring out a way to publicly blackmail her own injured daughter. She crossed her arms and nodded in agreement, completely endorsing this outright extortion. I pressed my hand against my throbbing side and took a very slow breath. "You are threatening to destroy my entire career, Jamal?" I asked, making sure my voice was loud and clear for his recording. "I am not threatening anything," Jamal laughed, his confidence completely overflowing. "I am simply giving you a very clear business proposition. You are a smart financial executive, Rebecca. You know how to calculate risk. So let us do some simple math right now. Your reputation and your massive $8 million firm are on the line. I hold the power to completely destroy all of it with one single click of a button." Jamal took a step closer, his physical presence looming over me. He began to lay out his exact demands with the arrogant swagger of a man who thought he had just won the lottery. "Here is what is going to happen," Jamal instructed, his tone cold and demanding. "First, you are going to take that official property deed sitting on the kitchen island, and you are going to legally sign this 5-bedroom house entirely over to me and Cassidy. We will not be your tenants anymore. We will be the sole owners. Second, you are going to open your little banking app and wire exactly $500,000 into a secure offshore account that I have already set up. Consider it hush money. Consider it trauma compensation for the immense emotional damage you have caused my pregnant wife today." Jamal puffed out his chest, looking incredibly proud of his master plan. "You see, Rebecca, I need that $500,000 to completely restart my tech company. My last investors pulled out because they did not understand my vision, but with your money I can finally build my empire. And since you are so rich, you will not even miss $500,000. It is a tiny drop in the bucket for a millionaire like you. But if you refuse, I will make sure you lose every single penny you have ever earned." He waved the recording phone right in front of my face. The red light blinked like a warning beacon. "You have exactly 5 minutes to transfer the deed and initiate the wire transfer," Jamal threatened. "If you hesitate, if you try to negotiate, or if you ask that federal agent to step in, I will upload this video immediately. Your entire corporate empire will burn to the ground before the sun sets today. I will ruin your name in this city. You will never get another high-paying client again. So what is it going to be, Rebecca? Your money or your life?" Jamal stood there grinning like a complete fool waiting for me to panic. He expected me to lunge for the phone and try to wrestle it out of his hands. He expected me to burst into tears and beg him not to ruin the business I had spent a decade building from nothing. My mother was actually smiling now, fully expecting me to finally surrender my wealth to her favorite child and her brilliant son-in-law. She was already calculating how much of that $500,000 Jamal would let her spend at the country club. But I did not flinch. I did not move a single muscle toward him. I did not raise my voice or show even the slightest hint of fear. I stood perfectly still in my blood-stained clothes and looked at him with a profound sense of pity. He truly had no idea who he was dealing with or how sophisticated federal investigations actually worked. He was so blinded by his own toxic greed and his desperate need to assert dominance over a woman that he had completely ignored the most important element of the room. He forgot that the man standing behind me was not a local security guard, but a highly trained federal investigator. I let out a soft, tired sigh. I did not look at my mother, and I did not look at Cassidy. I simply turned my head slowly and looked right over my shoulder at the man in the dark tailored suit standing quietly near the entryway. "Did you get all of that on the wire, Agent Donovan?" I asked, my voice perfectly calm and incredibly steady. I watched Jamal stand there with his phone raised high, a triumphant sneer plastered across his face. He genuinely believed he had just delivered the ultimate checkmate. He thought his little amateur video recording was going to force me to surrender my home and $500,000 of my hard-earned money. He was so completely wrapped up in his own narcissistic delusion that he actually thought he was the smartest person in the room. He expected me to panic, to cry, to beg for mercy. But I did not do any of those things. I simply maintained my posture, pressed my hand against my bandages, and asked Agent Donovan if he had caught all of that on the wire. Jamal froze. The incredibly arrogant smirk on his face instantly vanished, replaced by a look of profound confusion. He slowly lowered his smartphone, his eyes darting from me to the tall man in the dark suit standing quietly near the entryway. Agent Donovan did not say a single word at first. He simply reached up with one hand and lightly tapped a small, discreet, clear plastic earpiece tucked perfectly into his right ear. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he reached inside his tailored suit jacket and pulled back the fabric to reveal a small, high-tech microphone securely clipped to the inside of his collar. The tiny device was directly connected to a recording unit secured to his thick leather belt. Extortion for $500,000 and criminal blackmail. Agent Donovan announced, his voice echoing with absolute authority through the quiet living room. Recorded loud and clear on a state-authorized wiretap. You just threatened to destroy a corporate business reputation for financial gain and demanded the unlawful transfer of a property deed under extreme duress. That is a Class B felony in this state, Jamal. And since you attempted to extort an individual actively involved as a victim in an ongoing federal insurance fraud investigation, you just escalated this from a simple civil dispute to a major criminal offense. The heavy silence that followed was absolutely deafening. I actually watched the exact moment Jamal realized his entire life was over. His eyes widened to the size of saucers, and all the color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking pale and sickly. His fingers went completely numb. The expensive smartphone slipped right out of his grasp and hit the hardwood floor with a sharp crack, bouncing once before landing face down near the coffee table. His tough guy facade, the aggressive posture, the loud booming voice, all of it instantly crumbled into dust. He suddenly looked like a terrified little boy caught stealing from a candy store. He took a stumbling step backward, holding his hands up in a desperate defensive gesture. "Wait, hold on a second." Jamal stammered, his voice cracking with pure panic. "You have to understand, I did not mean any of that. I was just bluffing. I was just trying to protect my wife. It was her idea." He pointed a shaking finger directly at Cassidy, who was still sitting on the leather sofa wiping away her fake tears. "She told me to do it. She told me Rebecca was rich, and that we needed to get money out of her to pay off the state investigators. Cassidy is the one who committed the caregiver fraud. She forged the documents. She stole the money. I had nothing to do with it. She manipulated me into recording that video so she would not go to jail." Cassidy gasped so loudly, she practically choked on the air. Her eyes bulged out of her head as she stared at the man she had married. The man who was supposed to be her loyal partner in crime had just thrown her directly under the bus the absolute second he faced any real consequences. "How could you say that?" she screamed, her voice shrill and entirely unhinged. "You liar! You are the one who spent all the money on your stupid car and your failed business. You told me to keep cashing those checks. You said we deserved it. I did everything for you, and now you are trying to send me to prison to save your own pathetic skin." The two of them erupted into a vicious screaming match right there in the middle of my living room. They completely turned on each other, tearing apart their supposed perfect marriage in a desperate attempt to save themselves. Jamal yelled that Cassidy was a spoiled brat who ruined his life, while Cassidy shrieked that Jamal was a useless deadbeat who manipulated her. The toxic alliance they had built to exploit my money had completely shattered the moment real legal pressure was applied. It was a pathetic display of cowardice and betrayal. I just watched them tear each other apart, feeling absolutely nothing but a cold, deep sense of vindication. My mother, Brenda, stood frozen in the center of the room, watching her perfect golden family completely implode before her very eyes. Her favorite daughter and her brilliant son-in-law were actively confessing to major felonies on a recorded federal wiretap. The police officers outside were moving closer to the front porch, having heard the loud shouting match echoing through the windows. Brenda realized with absolute horror that Cassidy and Jamal were actually going to be arrested. They were going to be taken away in handcuffs, and she would be left completely alone to face the massive mess they had created. She looked at me with wild, desperate eyes, realizing I was not going to save them. But a true narcissist never surrenders even when all the facts are stacked completely against them. Brenda could not accept that her golden child was going to prison. She could not process the fact that she had lost total control of the situation. Her brain frantically searched for a way to twist the narrative back in her favor. She needed an audience. She needed her echo chamber. She reached into her massive designer tote bag sitting on the kitchen island and aggressively pulled out her silver iPad. Her hands were shaking violently as she frantically tapped the screen opening her video calling application. "You are not doing this, Rebecca," my mother screamed, her voice cracking with desperate, unhinged fury. "You are not going to send my daughter to prison just because you are a jealous, bitter woman. I am calling the family right now. We had a holiday check-in call scheduled anyway, and I am looping everyone in. We will see what your aunts and uncles think about you actively destroying this family. We will see how proud you are of yourself when the entire extended family sees what a monster you really are." My mother Brenda did not waste a single second. She snatched her silver tablet from the kitchen counter with trembling hands and violently tapped the screen. We already had a massive extended family video call scheduled for that exact afternoon. It was supposed to be a routine holiday check-in where everyone gossiped and showed off their latest purchases. My mother knew that the entire family was currently sitting in their respective living rooms across the country, just waiting for her to initiate the connection. She propped the tablet up against a heavy crystal vase on the kitchen island, making sure the wide-angle camera captured the entire disastrous scene unfolding in my living room. She wanted them to see the flashing police lights through the front windows. She wanted them to see Cassidy crying on the leather sofa. And most importantly, she wanted them to see me standing there looking like the cold, heartless villain she desperately needed me to be. The loud, cheerful, ringing tone of the video application echoed sharply through the tense quiet of the room. One by one, the small digital squares popped up on the bright screen. I could see Aunt Carol sitting in her Florida sunroom. I saw Uncle David and his wife logging in from their kitchen in Texas. Several cousins joined the call, their faces bright and smiling, completely unaware of the absolute nightmare they were about to walk into. They started waving and calling out cheerful greetings, but my mother instantly cut them off with a loud theatrical sob. She threw her hands up to her face and let out a devastating wail that instantly silenced the entire digital family gathering. "Oh my God, please, somebody help us," she cried, her voice shaking with perfectly manufactured terror. "You all need to see what is happening right now. You need to see what Rebecca is doing to her own flesh and blood." The digital squares on the screen instantly filled with looks of deep concern and confusion. Aunt Carol leaned closer to her camera, asking what was wrong and why there were flashing red and blue lights reflecting on the walls behind us. My mother pointed a shaking finger directly at me, making sure her face was perfectly centered in the camera frame. "Rebecca has completely lost her mind," my mother sobbed, leaning heavily against the counter as if she might faint from the sheer emotional trauma. "She is using her money to hire corrupt cops to come into this house and terrorize us. She is trying to throw Cassidy and Jamal out onto the street. They are just trying to build a life, and Rebecca is actively destroying them out of pure petty jealousy. She wants to see her own sister homeless and ruined." The reaction from the extended family was absolutely instantaneous and entirely predictable. They did not ask for my side of the story. They did not ask why federal agents were standing in my living room or why Jamal was completely silent and looking terrified in the background. They had spent the last 30 years being fed my mother's toxic narrative. They firmly believed that I was the difficult, problematic child, and that Cassidy was the sweet, innocent angel who could do absolutely no wrong. A chorus of angry, aggressive voices erupted from the small speakers of the tablet. Aunt Carol was the loudest, her face turning a deep shade of red as she yelled directly into her microphone. "You are sick, Rebecca," she screamed, her voice distorted by the digital connection. "You have always been a bitter, jealous girl, but this is a brand new low even for you. How could you possibly do this to your own family?" Uncle David immediately chimed in, his deep voice echoing with self-righteous authority. "Call those officers off right this second, Rebecca," he demanded, pointing a stern finger at his web camera. "We solve family problems internally. You do not ever involve the authorities with your own blood. You are a disgrace to this family name. She is your sister, for crying out loud." The barrage of insults and reprimands washed over me like a relentless storm. Cousin after cousin unmuted their microphones to throw their own verbal stones at me. They called me ungrateful. They called me a sociopath. They demanded that I apologize to my mother and write Cassidy a massive check to make up for the severe emotional distress I had just caused. They were a perfectly orchestrated echo chamber of toxic enablers, all completely manipulated by my mother's frantic tears. I stood there in the middle of my foyer, pressing my hand against my heavily bleeding abdominal stitches, and I just watched them. I did not yell back. I did not try to defend myself over the loud, chaotic shouting. I simply let them vent their entirely misplaced outrage. I let them show their true colors. Agent Donovan stood quietly in the corner, observing the massive family meltdown with total professional detachment. He knew exactly what I was doing. I was letting them dig their own graves. Through the chaos of the shouting voices, I heard Aunt Carol yell something that made me completely freeze. "You are a monster, Rebecca!" Aunt Carol shrieked, hitting her fist against her desk. "They are having a baby. How can you possibly put a pregnant woman and your unborn niece or nephew out on the cold street?" The digital shouting continued, but the words echoed loudly in my head. I took a slow, painful breath and slowly walked across the hardwood floor toward the kitchen island. I ignored the stinging pain in my side and stepped directly in front of the tablet camera. The wide-angle lens perfectly captured my pale, exhausted face and the dark red blood actively soaking through my white shirt. The sight of my fresh physical trauma made a few of the cousins suddenly fall silent, but Aunt Carol kept glaring at me. I leaned my hands flat on the marble counter and looked directly into the camera lens. "Did you say pregnant, Aunt Carol?" I asked, my voice incredibly quiet, but slicing right through the remaining noise like a freshly sharpened knife. "That is fascinating." Cassidy immediately saw a massive opening to completely win the entire family over to her side. She realized that the pregnancy narrative was the absolute ultimate shield against any kind of criticism or legal consequence. She scrambled up from the leather sofa, completely ignoring the ruined designer shopping bags scattered all around her feet. She rushed over to the kitchen island and aggressively pushed her way right next to our mother, making sure her face was front and center on the video call. Cassidy grabbed her perfectly flat stomach with both hands and began sobbing hysterically, looking directly into the camera lens with wide, terrified eyes. "It is true, Aunt Carol," she cried, forcing massive tears to roll down her cheeks. "I am 3 months along. We were going to announce it at the holidays, but Rebecca ruined everything. She knows I am pregnant, and she is still trying to put my unborn baby on the street. She wants me to go to jail, so I lose my child. She is a total monster." The extended family went absolutely wild. The digital squares completely erupted into a chaotic frenzy of furious cursing and screaming directed entirely at me. Uncle David called me a heartless villain. Aunt Carol started crying, wiping her eyes and telling Cassidy that everything was going to be all right and that the family would protect her from my horrible cruelty. The cousins began typing angry messages into the group chat, threatening to completely cut me out of their lives forever. My mother Brenda stood tall, acting completely vindicated. She wrapped her arm around Cassidy and glared at me with a look of pure triumphant hatred. "You hear that, Rebecca?" My mother demanded, her voice completely overflowing with toxic authority. "The entire family sees exactly what you are. Drop the charges immediately. Tell that federal agent to get out of my house right now. You are going to sign this property over to Jamal and Cassidy today for the sake of this innocent unborn child. If you do not do exactly what I say, you will never be a part of this family again." I looked at Cassidy. She was still clutching her stomach, sniffing dramatically, but I could see the faint, cruel little smirk playing right at the corners of her mouth. She honestly thought she had won. She thought she had successfully weaponized the entire extended family to completely shield herself from federal insurance fraud. She thought playing the ultimate victim card was going to force me into total submission, just like it always had in the past. I did not argue with my mother. I did not scream at my aunts and uncles to stop insulting me. I simply turned my back on the digital tablet and walked slowly toward the far end of the long kitchen counter. My silver work laptop was sitting right where I had left it before my appendix ruptured. I reached out and opened the sleek metal lid. The screen instantly glowed to life, illuminating my face in the dimly lit kitchen. I typed in my security password with quick, precise keystrokes. The loud, angry shouting from the tablet speakers continued to fill the room, but I completely tuned it out. I navigated directly to my encrypted forensic accounting files. I knew exactly where the specific document was located because I had spent hours carefully analyzing it just last month when I started officially auditing the massive financial ruins of Jamal and his completely failed tech startup. 3 months along, Cassidy, I asked, my voice echoing clearly over the chaotic noise of the video call. I kept my eyes locked on my laptop screen as I opened the highly secured digital folder. "Are you absolutely sure about that exact timeline?" Cassidy scoffed loudly, crossing her arms over her chest and glaring at my back. "Of course I am sure," she snapped, her voice dripping with extreme defensive attitude. "I am the mother. I think I would know exactly how far along I am. Stop trying to change the subject and tell your attack dog to leave us alone." I found the specific high-resolution scanned document I was looking for and clicked on it. The image expanded to fill my entire laptop screen. I took a deep breath, bracing my core against the sharp surgical pain, and carefully picked up my laptop. I walked back over to the kitchen island where the tablet was still broadcasting the furious faces of my extended family. I turned the laptop around and held the bright glowing screen directly in front of the tablet camera, making absolutely sure that every single person on the video call had a perfectly clear view of the highly detailed financial document. I also made sure Jamal, who was still standing silently in the background, frozen in pure terror from the wiretap revelation, had a clear line of sight to the screen. "You cannot possibly be 3 months pregnant by your husband Cassidy," I said, my voice completely steady and completely devoid of any emotion. "Because I audited Jamal and his startup business expenses last month." The bright glow of my laptop screen illuminated the dark polished marble of the kitchen island. I held the heavy silver computer perfectly steady, making absolutely certain that the wide-angle camera of my mother's tablet captured every single pixel of the document displayed on my screen. I did not say a word at first. I simply let the high-resolution image sit there in full view of the entire extended family, broadcasting live to living rooms all across the country. I also made sure the screen was angled just enough so that Jamal, standing frozen in the background of my living room, could see the bold black text printed across the top of the digital page. The chaotic screaming and cursing that had been pouring out of the tablet speakers just seconds ago began to slowly, aggressively die down. One by one, my aunts, uncles, and cousins leaned closer to their web cameras, squinting their eyes to read the document I was holding up. The absolute fury on their faces slowly morphed into profound, deep confusion. They had been expecting to see a fake lease agreement, or maybe a bank statement proving I was hoarding money. They were absolutely not expecting to see a highly detailed, itemized medical invoice. "That is a receipt for a bilateral vasectomy," I announced, my voice completely calm and echoing clearly through the sudden quiet of the room. I kept my eyes locked on the tablet camera, watching Aunt Carol and her jaw literally drop open. "It was performed at an exclusive, out-of-state men's health clinic exactly 2 years ago, and as you can see right there at the bottom of the invoice, it was paid in full using Jamal and his corporate business credit card. The exact same business credit card funded by the tech startup investors he completely defrauded." The silence that instantly crashed down on the Zoom call was absolute. You could have heard a single pin drop on my hardwood floor. It was a heavy, suffocating silence that sucked all the air right out of the room. The digital squares on the tablet screen were completely still, like a frozen photograph of a massive collective shock. Nobody blinked. Nobody breathed. The family members who had just spent the last 10 minutes viciously calling me a monster for trying to evict a pregnant woman were now staring at undeniable medical proof that the pregnancy was an absolute lie. Or worse, it was a complete betrayal. I slowly lowered my laptop and turned my attention back to the people actually standing in my house. My mother Brenda looked as if she had just been physically struck by a high-speed train. The triumphant, arrogant smirk she had worn just moments ago was entirely gone, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated horror. She stopped breathing, her chest completely frozen in place. She stared at me and then slowly turned her head to look at Cassidy. Her perfect golden child, the daughter she had sacrificed my entire childhood to protect, was standing there completely exposed. Cassidy had gone entirely pale. All the fake tears and the dramatic flushed color in her cheeks vanished, leaving her looking like a terrified ghost. Her hand slowly dropped away from her flat stomach, as if she had suddenly forgotten she was supposed to be playing the role of a distressed, expectant mother. She stared at the medical receipt on my laptop screen, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, but absolutely no sound came out. She was trapped. There was no clever lie, no manipulative tears, and no twisted excuse that could possibly explain away a highly documented surgical procedure. But the most dramatic reaction came from Jamal. Jamal stood in the center of the living room, his large, imposing frame completely rigid. He stared at my laptop screen with a look of pure, devastated realization. The federal wiretap and the threat of prison seemed to completely vanish from his mind entirely, replaced by a profound, deeply personal betrayal. His eyes darted from the medical receipt straight to Cassidy. The math was actively connecting in his head. He knew exactly what he had done 2 years ago at that clinic. He knew it was biologically impossible for him to be the father of the child Cassidy had just proudly announced to the entire family. The heavy silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Every single person was waiting for the inevitable explosion. Jamal took one slow, heavy step toward the kitchen island. His hands were shaking violently, not from fear of the police, but from pure, unfiltered rage. He stopped right in front of Cassidy, staring down at the woman he had married. His voice, when he finally spoke, was dangerously low and trembling with a terrifying kind of anger. "You told me you stopped taking your birth control pills because of the fraud investigation," Jamal whispered, his words slicing through the quiet room. "You told me the state investigators were tracking our medical expenses, so you had to stop picking up your prescriptions. You looked me dead in the eyes and cried, saying you were stressed about the money." Cassidy took a tiny, terrified step backward, bumping into the edge of the kitchen counter. "Jamal, please," she stammered, her voice barely a squeak. "I can explain. It is not what it looks like. Please just listen to me." Jamal did not listen. His eyes widened as the absolute reality of her massive lie completely shattered his ego. He took another step forward, towering over her. "If I had a vasectomy 2 years ago," Jamal demanded, his voice rising to a furious, booming shout, "who the hell is the father Cassidy?" The united front they had built to extort and abuse me completely shattered into a million irreparable pieces. Jamal did not wait for an answer. The sheer humiliation of finding out his wife was pregnant by another man, broadcast live to his entire extended family, completely overrode any logical thought. He let out a loud, furious roar and lunged directly at Cassidy. He did not hit her, but he grabbed the expensive designer sweater she was wearing violently, shaking her and screaming at the top of his lungs about her infidelity and her massive betrayal. Cassidy shrieked in absolute terror, throwing her hands up to protect her face as she stumbled backward against the marble island. The sudden, violent movement instantly triggered the law enforcement officers waiting just outside the front door. The two local police officers who had been standing on the porch charged into the foyer, their heavy boots pounding against the hardwood floor. They shouted loud, clear commands, rushing straight past me to physically separate Jamal from Cassidy. One officer grabbed Jamal by the shoulders, pulling him forcefully backward, while the other officer stepped right in between them, placing a firm hand on Cassidy and instructing her to stay put. Agent Donovan stepped forward, his posture completely relaxed, but his eyes sharp, monitoring the entire physical altercation with cold professional detachment. On the kitchen counter, my mother's tablet completely erupted into absolute chaos. The extended family on the Zoom call went entirely wild. The digital squares lit up with frantic movement and screaming voices. The aunts who had just passionately defended Cassidy as a sweet, innocent mother were now shrieking in pure horror at the deceit. Uncle David was yelling something about the disgrace to the family name, and Cousin Diane was covering her mouth with both hands, shaking her head in total disbelief. The sheer volume of their collective outrage was deafening, echoing through the room, and adding to the massive physical chaos unfolding between the police and Jamal. I stood there, pressing my hand against my bleeding surgical stitches, feeling incredibly tired but overwhelmingly vindicated. I reached over to the tablet and calmly tapped the small microphone icon on the screen. The loud, digital screaming instantly vanished. I muted the iPad, leaving the entire extended family to watch the absolute disaster unfold in completely silent, high-definition video. They could see the flashing police lights. They could see the officers restraining Jamal, and they could see their perfect golden child backed into a corner. Cassidy realized she was completely trapped. Her husband was screaming curses at her, the police were actively investigating her for federal fraud, and her entire family had just witnessed her ultimate lie. In true narcissistic fashion, instead of showing any remorse or taking accountability, she decided to blame the absolute closest target she could find. She pointed a shaking, manicured finger directly at me. "This is all your fault," Rebecca Cassidy screamed, struggling against the police officer who was telling her to calm down. "You did this to me. You never gave us enough money to live comfortably." Jamal was always stressed about his stupid failing business, and he was always angry. "You made me live in your guest wing like a pathetic charity case while you sat on millions of dollars. I was miserable. I needed someone to make me feel special. I needed comfort. She was completely unhinged now, spilling her own dark secrets, just to justify her terrible behavior. She proudly announced to the entire room and the muted tablet that she had been sleeping with a wealthy personal trainer from the country club. She claimed he actually bought her nice things without making her feel guilty, unlike her broke husband and her selfish sister. She actually believed her lack of luxury funding justified committing federal fraud and having a secret affair. Jamal let out a loud, bitter laugh as the police officer held him back. "You hear that?" he yelled, looking at Agent Donovan. "She is a fraud and a liar. Take her to jail. I will testify against her for the state. I will give you everything you need to lock her up." My mother. Brenda stood completely paralyzed against the living room wall, watching her carefully constructed reality burn completely to ashes. Her entire identity was built on the grand illusion of her perfect, successful family. Now her golden daughter was a confirmed adulterer and a federal criminal, and her son-in-law was offering to be the star witness for the prosecution. She could not cope with the immense, crushing shame of the situation. Her brain simply refused to accept that Cassidy was entirely at fault. Brenda slowly turned her head and locked her eyes on me. Her face was completely devoid of color, but her eyes burned with a dark, terrifying kind of hatred. She did not look at the police or her crying daughter. She looked at the woman who had dared to pull the curtain back and expose the truth. She decided right then and there that she was going to go for the absolute nuclear option. She was going to destroy me completely. The chaotic scene in my living room had reached a fever pitch of absolute disaster. The two local police officers were physically restraining Jamal, who was still completely losing his mind over the revelation of Cassidy and her affair. Cassidy was backed into the corner crying hysterically and screaming desperate excuses, while Agent Donovan watched the entire mess with cold professional detachment. On the kitchen counter, my laptop screen still brightly displayed the undeniable proof of the medical clinic receipt, while my mother's silver tablet silently broadcast the horrifying spectacle to our completely shocked extended family across the country. It was the complete and total destruction of the perfect family image my mother had spent her entire life meticulously building. Brenda stood paralyzed against the hallway wall, her pristine white tennis outfit now looking ridiculously out of place in the middle of an active crime scene. I watched her eyes dart frantically around the room, absorbing the absolute ruin of her golden child and her perfect son-in-law. A normal mother would have felt profound sadness or perhaps a deep sense of shame for enabling such incredibly toxic behavior. A normal mother would have looked at me standing there bleeding through my surgical bandages and realized how terribly she had failed to protect her own daughter. But Brenda was not capable of that kind of self-reflection. In her twisted narcissistic mind, she was the ultimate victim, and someone had to pay for making her look bad in front of the entire family. She slowly pushed herself off the wall, her face completely draining of color until she looked like a ghost. But her eyes burned with a dark, terrifying kind of rage. She did not look at the police. She did not look at Jamal. She locked her furious gaze entirely on me. Her brain simply refused to process the fact that Cassidy was a federal criminal who had cheated on her husband. Instead, she violently twisted the narrative, deciding that I was the true villain for daring to expose the ugly truth. Brenda took a heavy step toward the kitchen island, her body shaking with pure, unadulterated fury. She raised her hand and pointed a trembling, perfectly manicured finger directly at my face. "You ruined this family!" she screamed, her voice tearing through the noisy room like a jagged knife. "You planned all of this just to embarrass us. You could not stand seeing your sister happy, so you orchestrated this entire nightmare to humiliate her in front of the authorities and the whole extended family. You are a disgusting, jealous monster, Rebecca." I stood my ground, pressing my hand gently against my throbbing side. I did not interrupt her. I knew she was gearing up for her ultimate performance. This was the moment she had been threatening for years. Whenever I stepped out of line, whenever I did not bend to her ridiculous demands, she always used the exact same weapon to force me back into total submission. She firmly believed that money was the ultimate leash, and she thought she held the thickest leash of all. Brenda reached into her expensive designer tote bag with violent, aggressive movements. She pulled out her smartphone, gripping it so tightly her knuckles turned completely white. She held the phone up in the air, as if it were some kind of incredibly powerful weapon ready to completely obliterate my future. "I am calling my lawyer right now," my mother announced, her voice echoing with a dark, vicious authority. "I am changing my will today. I am writing you out completely, Rebecca. You are entirely disinherited. You will not get a single cent of my estate when I die. Every single penny, every piece of jewelry, every property, and every last asset is going entirely to Cassidy. You are getting absolutely nothing." She stood there breathing heavily, her chest heaving with the effort of her grand, dramatic declaration. The arrogant, triumphant smirk slowly returned to her face, cutting through the pure rage. She honestly believed she had just delivered the most devastating financial blow imaginable. In her mind, her estate was a massive aristocratic fortune that I had been desperately waiting to inherit. She thought she was entirely cutting me off from a life of incredible luxury and privilege. She crossed her arms over her chest and tilted her chin up, looking down her nose at me with a sickeningly smug expression. She was waiting for the panic to set in. She fully expected me to drop to my knees and beg for her forgiveness. She thought the sudden threat of losing my precious inheritance would instantly break my resolve and force me to call off the federal investigator. She wanted me to cry and apologize for exposing Cassidy just so I could stay in her good graces and keep my place in her last will and testament. The heavy tension hung in the room. Jamal stopped struggling for a brief second, hearing the word estate and realizing there might still be some kind of massive payout coming to his wife. Cassidy looked up, wiping her ruined makeup, hoping that our mother's grand fortune would somehow save her from federal prison. Even the extended family, watching silently on the tablet, probably thought this was the absolute ultimate punishment for a rebellious daughter. But I did not panic. I did not cry, and I absolutely did not beg. I looked at my mother standing there in her expensive tennis outfit, acting like a powerful billionaire, deciding the fate of her peasants. I thought about the thousands of dollars I had quietly wired to her bank account just to keep the lights on in her house. I thought about the secret phone calls where she cried about her massive credit card bills, begging me to bail her out before her country club friends found out she was actually broke. She had spent my entire life pretending to be incredibly wealthy while secretly drowning in a massive ocean of debt that I had been secretly managing for her. She was a woman who leased luxury vehicles on terrible high-interest financing plans just to maintain an illusion while relying on my hard-earned money to prevent total bankruptcy. The sheer profound delusion of her threat was simply too much to handle. A slow, genuine smile spread across my face. I could not help it. The absolute absurdity of the situation finally broke through the physical pain of my surgical wounds. I let out a soft, quiet laugh that made my mother narrow her eyes in deep confusion. She could not understand why her ultimate punishment was not working. I slowly leaned my weight against the cool, polished marble of the kitchen counter, completely relaxing my posture. I looked my mother directly in the eyes, stripping away 33 years of carefully constructed lies and toxic financial manipulation with just 4 simple words. "What estate, Mom?" I asked, my voice perfectly calm and crystal clear. "What estate, Mom?" The question hung in the heavy air of the living room, sharp and undeniable. My mother stood there against the hallway wall, looking incredibly confident, with her hand resting firmly on her hip. She was completely convinced that she possessed the ultimate financial leverage over my life. She honestly believed that threatening to withhold my inheritance would send me crumbling to my knees in absolute panic. It was a fascinating display of total psychological delusion. I looked at the woman who had spent the last 3 decades making me feel like a financial burden, and I felt a profound wave of exhaustion wash over me. The physical pain from my torn surgical stitches was a dull, constant throb, but the heavy emotional weight of protecting her terrible secrets had suddenly and completely evaporated. I slowly shook my head, my eyes locking onto hers, ready to completely dismantle the grand illusion she had forced our family to live under for my entire adult life. I carefully pushed myself away from the polished marble counter of the kitchen island. Every single movement was a calculated effort to minimize the agonizing burning sensation in my lower abdomen, but I did not let the intense physical pain show on my face. I walked slowly and deliberately back toward my dark canvas hospital bag resting near the entryway. The local police officers were still holding Jamal against the far wall, and Cassidy was still sobbing hysterically in the corner over her ruined marriage, but my mother and I were locked in our own private, devastating standoff. I reached down and unzipped the side compartment of the canvas bag. My fingers bypassed the prescription painkillers and the extra sterile gauze reaching deep into the bottom of the tote. I grasped the incredibly thick, heavy manila folder I had securely packed right before my emergency surgery. It was significantly heavier than the property deed I had shown Jamal earlier. I pulled it out the thick stack of papers inside, shifting with a solid, satisfying weight. I turned around and walked directly toward my mother. Her smug, arrogant expression began to falter just a fraction of an inch as she watched me approach with the massive file. She had expected desperate begging and tearful apologies, not heavy legal documentation. I stopped barely 2 feet away from her pristine white tennis outfit. With a completely calm, fluid motion, I raised my hand and simply let go of the folder. It hit the hardwood floor right at the tips of her expensive designer sneakers with a loud, incredibly heavy slap that echoed over the chaotic background noise of the living room. The thick folder burst open upon impact, spilling a massive cascade of heavily stamped bank notices, final warning letters, and legally binding financial ledgers all across the polished wood. My mother flinched, stepping back slightly as the papers fanned out across her expensive shoes. "Are you talking about the house that is currently in active foreclosure, Mom?" I asked, my voice rising just enough to command the absolute attention of the room. I pointed down at the top document, which was a brightly colored final notice from a major national bank. "Or maybe you are talking about the $90,000 in high-interest credit card debt that you desperately hid from Dad and his life insurance payout." The color completely drained from her face, leaving her looking sickly and hollow. Her eyes darted wildly from my face down to the incredibly detailed financial documents covering the floor. I watched her breathing become shallow and erratic as the absolute reality of her situation finally shattered her perfect country club facade. "I am a professional forensic accountant, Mom," I stated clearly, letting each word sink deep into her fragile, broken ego. "You spent years telling your friends I was a failure because I did not become a lawyer, but my actual career is entirely dedicated to tracking down every single penny of hidden money. I did not just use my highly specialized skills to track Jamal and his pathetic caregiver fraud. When your primary mortgage lender flagged your account for severe delinquency 3 months ago, my firm was notified because my name was originally listed as an emergency contact on your oldest banking files. I saw exactly how badly you had destroyed your own finances while simultaneously funding Cassidy and her endless luxury shopping sprees." Brenda opened her mouth to speak, to offer some kind of desperate lie or excuse, but she was completely paralyzed by the undeniable proof scattered at her feet. I did not let her interrupt me. I stepped slightly closer, delivering the final devastating blow to her massive ego. "When the bank finally gave up on you and sold your massive debt to a ruthless third-party collection agency last Thursday, I was the one who answered the phone. I did not pay it off to save you this time, Mom. I bought it. I purchased your entire debt portfolio from the collection agency for pennies on the dollar through a private corporate trust." My mother let out a small, breathless gasp, her hands flying up to cover her mouth. "I own your debt," I told her, my voice cold and entirely stripped of any daughterly affection. "Every single credit card, every missed car payment, and the entire remaining balance of your severely underwater mortgage now legally belongs to me. You do not have an estate to threaten me with. You do not have an inheritance to withhold from me. You have an ocean of terrible debt, and you have me as your primary legal creditor. And let me make one thing absolutely perfectly clear to you right now. I do not forgive loans, and I absolutely do not negotiate with people who abandon me in hospitals. Brenda collapsed against the hallway wall, her legs literally giving out beneath her as the absolute totality of her financial ruin crashed down on her shoulders. She was completely broken, stripped of her fake wealth, her golden child, and her ultimate leverage all in one single afternoon. The heavy, stunned silence in the room was finally broken by a sharp, highly professional voice. Agent Donovan stepped forward into the center of the foyer, completely ignoring the dramatic family breakdown. He calmly pulled back the cuff of his dark tailored suit jacket and checked his silver wristwatch. "Time is up," he announced, his voice carrying the absolute weight of federal authority. "Officers execute the seizure warrants." The command from Agent Donovan hung in the air for barely a second before the entire house transformed into a highly efficient staging ground for federal asset forfeiture. The two local police officers who had been securing the hallway immediately stepped forward, moving with practiced military precision. Two more officers walked through the front door, carrying thick, transparent evidence bags and heavy digital clipboards. The grand illusion of wealth and success that my sister and her husband had so carefully curated was about to be dismantled piece by piece right in front of my eyes. Agent Donovan stood in the center of the foyer, his hands clasped neatly behind his back, pointing out the specific luxury items that had been previously cataloged during his covert financial investigation. The officers started right in the living room, specifically targeting the massive mountain of luxury shopping bags Cassidy had carelessly dumped across my custom leather sofa. One officer, a tall, no-nonsense woman, pulled out a thick plastic evidence bag and began dropping the pristine designer boxes inside. She grabbed the expensive makeup palettes, the silk scarves, and the high-heel shoes that Cassidy had purchased just hours ago, using the stolen state caregiver funds. Cassidy watched from the corner, her eyes wide with absolute horror, as the physical manifestations of her fake aristocratic lifestyle were unceremoniously shoved into cheap plastic bags. The officer then reached for the crown jewel of Cassidy and her stolen collection. It was a massive limited edition Louis Vuitton handbag sitting right on the edge of the coffee table. That was the breaking point for my sister. The intense shock of the vasectomy revelation and the federal wiretap suddenly gave way to a primal, desperate materialism. Cassidy let out a high-pitched shriek and lunged away from the wall, completely ignoring the officer who had told her to stay perfectly still. She scrambled across the expensive living room rug and threw her hands over the designer handbag, gripping the leather handles with white-knuckle intensity. She tried to physically rip the bag right out of the police officer, and her hands screaming that it was hers and that nobody was allowed to touch her things. It was the absolute most pathetic display of entitlement I had ever seen. She was literally fighting the police over a purse she had bought with stolen money. The female officer did not hesitate for a single second. She did not coddle Cassidy or treat her like a delicate country club princess. She forcefully twisted the handbag out of Cassidy and her grip, dropping it onto the floor. In one swift, fluid motion, she spun Cassidy around, grabbing both of her wrists and forcing them firmly behind her back. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs echoing through the living room was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard. Cassidy gasped in absolute terror, her knees buckling slightly as the cold metal locked securely around her wrists. She was immediately read her rights for a second time, including a brand new charge for resisting arrest and obstructing a federal investigation. She was pushed back down onto the sofa now, officially a detained criminal in her own mind. While Cassidy was being completely neutralized on the sofa, another officer turned his attention directly to Jamal. Jamal was still leaning heavily against the hallway wall, looking completely defeated and broken by the revelation of his wife and her terrible infidelity. The officer instructed Jamal to place his hands flat against the wall and began a thorough physical search of his pockets. Jamal did not resist. He let out a low, pathetic whimper as the officer pulled out his expensive leather wallet, his designer sunglasses, and finally the heavy, sleek black key fob for his luxury electric vehicle. The officer held the key fob up, showing it to Agent Donovan, who gave a short, approving nod. That key represented the absolute peak of Jamal and his fraudulent tech startup fantasy. A loud, heavy rumbling sound suddenly vibrated through the large bay windows of the living room. I watched Jamal slowly turn his head, looking out through the sheer white curtains toward the front driveway. A massive industrial tow truck had just backed up right onto the edge of my manicured lawn. The bright amber warning lights on top of the truck flashed rhythmically, painting the walls of my house with a harsh yellow glow. The tow truck operator stepped out, unspooled a thick steel cable, and began hooking it directly to the front axle of the pristine luxury vehicle parked outside. Jamal watched the heavy chains wrap around the expensive tires of the car he had bought using the money he stole from innocent investors and my own medical identity. The absolute reality of their crushing poverty finally hit them like a physical blow. Without the fraudulent caregiver checks arriving every month, and without the free luxury housing I had unknowingly provided, they owned absolutely nothing. Every single expensive item in this house, every designer label, and every status symbol was built entirely on a foundation of lies and my own personal pain. They had spent 8 months acting like wealthy, successful elites, looking down their noses at me, while they secretly drained the life out of my finances. Now stripped of their stolen assets and their fake lease agreement, they were completely destitute. They had absolutely zero savings, no legitimate income, and no legal residence. They were going to walk out of my house with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Jamal pressed his forehead against the cold glass of the window and began to sob. It was not a quiet, dignified cry. It was a loud, ugly, heavy sobbing that shook his entire large frame. The man who had just tried to aggressively extort me for $500,000 was now weeping uncontrollably as he watched his ultimate status symbol being slowly dragged up the steel ramp of a tow truck. He had lost his fake business, he had lost his unfaithful wife, and now he was losing the very last piece of his completely fabricated identity. He cried for the car because he was entirely incapable of crying for the terrible things he had done to his own family. I turned my eyes away from the pathetic display at the window and looked down at my mother. Brenda was still standing near the kitchen island, completely surrounded by the massive sea of debt collection notices I had dropped at her feet. She looked from the handcuffs on Cassidy to the tow truck outside, and then finally down to the incredibly thick stack of financial ruin laying on the hardwood floor. Her entire carefully constructed universe had just collapsed in a matter of 20 minutes. Her golden daughter was a criminal, her son-in-law was a fraud, and she was entirely at the absolute mercy of the daughter she had abused her entire life. Brenda slowly sank down. Her knees hit the hard wooden floor with a heavy thud right in the middle of her foreclosure notices. She looked up at me, tears streaming down her face, crying real tears for the very first time, realizing she was completely ruined. My mother, Brenda, was kneeling right in the middle of my polished hardwood floor, entirely surrounded by the thick ocean of her own financial ruin. The heavy foreclosure notices and the massive credit card collection letters were scattered all around her expensive designer sneakers like a mocking reminder of her completely fake reality. Just 5 minutes ago, she had been standing tall with her hand on her hip trying to threaten me with the loss of an inheritance that literally did not exist. She had acted like a powerful aristocrat, passing down a devastating judgment upon a disobedient child. Now the grand illusion was completely shattered. She was reduced to a trembling, desperate woman who finally realized she had absolutely no power left. Her golden daughter was sitting on the sofa in cold steel handcuffs. Her son-in-law was weeping violently by the window as his car was towed away. And her oldest daughter, the one she had spent 33 years emotionally abusing, was now her primary legal creditor. Brenda looked up at me, her makeup completely ruined by the sudden flood of genuine tears. For my entire life, I had craved just one single moment of genuine emotion from her. I had spent my childhood desperately trying to earn her validation, bringing home straight grades, cleaning the house, and staying out of trouble, just hoping she would look at me the way she looked at Cassidy. She never did. But now, staring up at me from the floor, her eyes were wide and filled with a frantic, desperate energy. She suddenly reached out, pushing past the scattered legal documents, and grabbed both of my hands. Her grip was incredibly tight, her perfectly manicured nails digging into my skin. Her hands were shaking violently, transferring her absolute panic directly into my body. "I am so sorry, Rebecca," she cried, her voice cracking with a high-pitched, desperate wail. "I am so incredibly sorry for everything. I was wrong. I was so blinded by everything else and I did not see how much you were hurting. Please, you have to listen to me. I will be a real mother to you now. I promise I will make it all up to you. We can fix this. Just tell the collection agency to drop the debt. Tell these police officers to leave Cassidy alone and get out of our house. We do not need them here. We can be a real family, Rebecca. Just the three of us again. I love you so much. Please, just give me a chance to be the mother you always wanted." I stood perfectly still, letting her hold my hands. I listened to her frantic promises and her desperate declarations of love. If she had said these exact words to me 10 years ago, or even 5 years ago, I would have collapsed into her arms, weeping with absolute joy. I would have given her every single penny I owned, just to keep that fleeting illusion of maternal affection alive. I would have done anything to feel like I finally belonged in my own family. But standing there with my abdomen throbbing from fresh surgical wounds, I felt absolutely nothing. There was no warmth in her grip. There was no genuine love in her tear-filled eyes. There was only the raw, terrified panic of a cornered animal realizing its absolute survival depended entirely on the mercy of the creature it had spent its whole life tormenting. I looked down at the woman begging for my help, and my mind immediately flashed back to the recovery room at the hospital just 48 hours prior. I remembered waking up from the intense anesthesia, my throat completely raw from the breathing tube, and my side burning with an agonizing pain. I remembered the kind nurse asking me who was coming to drive me home. I remembered reaching for my phone with trembling hands and seeing the text message from my mother. I had told her it was an emergency surgery. I had told her I was completely alone and scared. Her response had been a brief, cold message telling me that she and Cassidy were busy at the country club and that I should just download an application and get an Uber to bring myself home. She did not even ask if I was going to be okay. She completely abandoned me in my most vulnerable moment because I was simply an inconvenience to her afternoon plans. I looked at her perfectly styled hair and her expensive white tennis outfit, and a deep, profound sense of finality washed over me. I did not feel angry anymore. The fiery rage had entirely burned itself out, leaving behind a completely cold, solid iron boundary. I slowly but firmly pulled my hands out of her desperate grip. I took one deliberate step backward, breaking the physical connection between us. Brenda gasped, her hands hovering in the empty space, her eyes widening as she realized the tears were not working. "Your love was always transactional, Mom," I said, my voice incredibly quiet, but perfectly steady. "You never loved me when I was struggling. You never loved me when I was just your daughter trying to make you proud. You only love me right now in this exact moment because I am the bank. You are not apologizing for how you treated me. You are apologizing to the person holding your mortgage. You do not want a real family. You just want a financial bailout, and you are willing to say absolutely anything to get it." Brenda opened her mouth to argue, shaking her head frantically, but the words completely failed her. She knew I was right. She could not point to a single instance in my entire adult life where she had chosen me over her own selfish desires, or over Cassidy. I reached into the thick manila folder I was still holding in my left hand. There was one final document tucked securely in the very back pocket. It was not a bank statement or a past due notice. It was a formal, legally binding piece of paper that I had personally requested from the debt collection agency the moment I purchased her portfolio. I pulled the crisp white document out and held it out toward her. Brenda stared at the paper, her breathing shallow and ragged. She slowly reached out with a trembling hand and took it from me. She looked down at the bold black lettering printed across the top of the page. It was an official notice of eviction. The debt collection agency was formally seizing the property to satisfy the massive outstanding balances. She had exactly 30 days to vacate the premises before the local sheriff would arrive to physically remove her and her belongings. You told me today that I did not understand family loyalty. I continued looking down at her completely shattered expression. You told me that I was a cruel, selfish person for holding on to my money. But you taught me everything I know about conditional love, Mom. You taught me that relationships are just business transactions. So this is me closing our account. I took another step backward, putting even more distance between us. I am not going to drop the debt. I am not going to call off the federal investigators. I am not going to save Cassidy from the very real consequences of committing major federal crimes. And I am absolutely not going to save your house. You have 30 days to pack up whatever the bank does not seize and figure out a new living arrangement. Brenda let out a low, agonizing sob, clutching the eviction notice to her chest, as if she could physically squeeze the reality out of the paper. She rocked back and forth on the floor, completely broken and entirely alone. My peace of mind is absolutely priceless, I told her, delivering the final closing statement of our relationship. I have spent my entire life paying for your mistakes and funding your incredibly toxic illusions. But today, the payments stop. And the best part is it costs me exactly $0 to cut you out of my life permanently. I turned my back on her, leaving her kneeling in the pile of her own destruction. I walked back toward the kitchen island, resting my hand gently against the cool marble to steady myself. The intense drama had drained almost all of my physical energy, but my mind had never felt more incredibly clear and liberated. Just as I turned around, Agent Donovan gave a sharp, definitive nod to the local police officers. The time for talking was officially over. The officers stepped forward, taking firm hold of Jamal and Cassidy. Jamal was still weeping, his head hanging low in absolute shame. Cassidy was still trying to pull away her ruined makeup, smeared all over her face, her designer clothes completely wrinkled. The officers pulled them roughly toward the front door. It was finally time for their exit. The heavy oak front door of my house was suddenly thrown wide open by the local police officers. The bright, blinding afternoon sunlight instantly flooded the dark foyer, casting long, harsh shadows across the hardwood floor. It was a beautiful, crisp suburban day, completely at odds with the absolute devastation taking place inside my home. Agent Donovan led the way, stepping out onto the massive concrete porch, while the two uniformed officers firmly escorted Jamal and Cassidy right behind him. They were both in heavy steel handcuffs, their arms pulled awkwardly behind their backs. The time for hiding behind closed doors and pretending to be a wealthy, perfect family was officially over. They were being marched out into the glaring light of reality in broad daylight for the entire world to see. My neighborhood was a quiet, exclusive homeowners association, filled with perfectly manicured lawns, large trees, and incredibly nosy people. The loud, violent screeching of my mother's car jumping the curb earlier, combined with the heavy rumbling of the massive tow truck dragging Jamal and his luxury car down the street, had drawn quite a crowd. Every single one of my wealthy neighbors was currently standing outside on their pristine green lawns or peering over their perfectly trimmed hedges. They had all stopped walking their expensive dogs and paused their afternoon jogs to watch the unbelievable spectacle unfolding right in my front yard. For 8 months, Cassidy and my mother had paraded around this exact neighborhood, acting like absolute royalty. They had attended community block parties bragging about Jamal and his massive tech startup, and complaining loudly about how they had to take care of their poor disabled sister. Now those same neighbors were watching the golden couple being marched out of my house in federal custody. Cassidy immediately realized she had a massive audience. The absolute horror of being publicly exposed completely broke whatever tiny shred of dignity she had left. She aggressively ducked her head, trying desperately to hide her tear-stained, ruined face behind her tangled blonde hair. She twisted her shoulders, trying to pull away from the firm grip of the police officer, but the sudden frantic movement was a terrible mistake. She was still wearing the incredibly high, expensive designer stilettos she had purchased during her stolen shopping spree. As she tried to blindly rush down the concrete front steps to escape the staring eyes of the neighbors, the thin heel of her right shoe caught directly in the small gap between the bricks. Cassidy let out a sharp, terrified shriek as her ankle violently twisted. Because her hands were tightly secured behind her back in steel handcuffs, she had absolutely no way to brace herself or break her fall. She pitched forward entirely out of control and crashed hard onto the rough concrete walkway. She landed awkwardly on her knees, and her shoulder tearing the fabric of her expensive silk blouse and scraping her bare skin. It was an incredibly pathetic, humiliating sight. She lay there on the cold, hard ground, sobbing loudly and begging for someone to help her up while the entire neighborhood watched in stunned, absolute silence. Jamal was walking right behind her, guided by the second police officer. He saw his wife trip and fall hard onto the concrete, but he did not flinch. He did not call out her name or ask the officers to check if she was hurt. He simply stopped walking for a brief second, looked down at her completely ruined form with eyes full of absolute cold disgust, and then turned his head away. He refused to even look at the woman who had completely destroyed his life with her massive lies and infidelity. He waited silently for the officer to pull Cassidy back up to her feet before continuing his slow, shameful march toward the parked police cruisers. The toxic united front they had used to terrorize me was entirely dead and buried. While Cassidy and Jamal were being loaded into the back of the flashing police cars, another officer gently but firmly placed his hand on my mother's shoulder. Brenda had been standing frozen in the foyer, watching her children being taken away. The officer instructed her that it was time to leave the premises immediately. She did not fight him. She looked completely hollowed out as she slowly walked out the front door and down the steps, clutching the official eviction notice I had given her tightly to her chest. But the moment Brenda reached the public sidewalk, the sheer weight of the staring neighbors finally snapped whatever was left of her fragile mind. She saw Mrs. Gable from 3 houses down, holding a cell phone and whispering to another neighbor. My mother suddenly stopped walking and completely lost her mind. She started waving her hands wildly, clutching the eviction papers and screaming at the top of her lungs. "Stop looking at me!" she shrieked, her voice echoing violently down the quiet suburban street. "Stop staring at us, you pathetic busybodies. Mind your own business. We are a good family. We are better than all of you." She stood entirely alone on the concrete sidewalk, screaming at the sky, while the neighbors simply shook their heads in pity and disgust. She had completely driven away the only person who had ever truly tried to take care of her, and now she had absolutely nothing left but her own toxic bitterness. I stood in the doorway of my beautiful home, pressing my hand against my bandages, and watched the chaos for one final moment. Then I took a deep breath and stepped backward. I grabbed the heavy brass handle and pulled it shut. The heavy wood swung closed, cutting off the sight of my screaming mother and the flashing police lights. I turned the solid deadbolt, hearing the mechanical click. The house was perfectly quiet and incredibly peaceful. I finally walked upstairs to get some rest. 6 months later, everything completely changed. 6 months have passed since that chaotic afternoon in my living room. Today, the brilliant afternoon sun is pouring through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of my downtown executive office. I am sitting behind my custom mahogany desk, looking out over the beautiful sweeping city skyline. I take a deep, comfortable breath. There is absolutely no pain in my abdomen anymore. The surgical incision has completely healed, leaving behind nothing but a faint, pale scar. But that physical scar is not the only thing that healed. The deep, invisible wounds that my toxic family inflicted on me for 33 years have finally closed for good. I am completely healthy, incredibly successful, and for the very first time in my entire life, I am completely at peace. I reach across my desk and pick up a thick stack of official court documents my lawyer sent over this morning. I slowly flip through the crisp white pages, reading the final legal resolutions of my family and their massive web of lies. Cassidy did not go to federal prison, but her punishment is arguably much worse for someone so utterly obsessed with luxury and status. She accepted a harsh plea deal to avoid jail time. She is currently serving 18 months of strict supervised probation and 500 hours of mandatory community service. The girl who used to spend my hard-earned money on limited edition designer handbags is now spending her weekends wearing a bright orange safety vest, picking up trash along the side of the state highway. She also has a permanent felony record, which means she will never be able to hold a corporate job or open a normal line of credit ever again. Jamal did not fare any better. The moment he realized the federal government was going to seize every single asset he owned, he immediately filed for personal bankruptcy. The arrogant tech entrepreneur who tried to extort me for $500,000 is now completely broke. But his ultimate downfall was the absolute destruction of his marriage. The vasectomy revelation completely broke him. He immediately filed for a highly contested divorce, desperately trying to distance himself from Cassidy and her unborn child. He moved into a cheap motel on the outskirts of the city and is currently working a minimum wage retail job just to pay off the massive legal fees he accumulated during the fraud investigation. They completely destroyed each other, just like I knew they would. And then there is my mother. Brenda was officially evicted from her massive colonial home exactly 30 days after I dropped that debt portfolio at her feet. The bank seized the property and auctioned it off to cover a portion of her incredible debt. Without my silent financial support and without the grand illusion of her country club wealth, she was left with absolutely nothing. She is currently living in a tiny, subsidized studio apartment on the bad side of town. Sometimes out of pure morbid curiosity, I check her public social media pages. She spends her days posting incredibly long, frantic updates, complaining about how her ungrateful, wealthy daughter completely abandoned her. She begs for sympathy and tries to play the ultimate victim. But the most satisfying part is the absolute silence that follows her posts. There are 0 likes. There are 0 comments. The entire extended family completely cut her off after witnessing the massive disaster on that video call. She is entirely alone, trapped in an echo chamber of her own bitter design. I closed the legal folder and slid it into my desk drawer, shutting it with a firm, satisfying click. That chapter of my life is officially closed. Right at that moment, a soft, gentle knock echoes from my office door. I look up and a warm, genuine smile immediately spreads across my face. It is Mark. 6 months ago, I knew him as Special Agent Donovan, the cold professional investigator who helped me dismantle my toxic family. But after the fraud case officially closed, he asked me out for coffee. We quickly realized we had a deep mutual respect for each other that blossomed into something incredibly beautiful. He steps into my office looking handsome and relaxed in a casual button-down shirt. He is holding 2 steaming cups of expensive artisan coffee. He walks over to my desk, his eyes soft and incredibly kind. He hands me my favorite coffee and asks if I am ready for our lunch date. I stand up, grabbing my purse, and I tell him that I have never been more ready for anything in my entire life. I walk around the desk and he offers me his arm. We walk out of my office together, stepping into the bright hallway, leaving the shadows of my past far behind. They thought my surgery made me weak. They didn't realize that cutting out the toxic, infected parts of your life is the only way to heal. Have you ever had to legally sever ties with toxic family? Tell me your story in the comments. Never let anyone make you a guest in your own life. The story of Rebecca and her family serves as a powerful reminder that biological connection does not automatically grant someone a permanent pass to disrespect, exploit, or manipulate you. In many toxic family dynamics, there is often a golden child who is shielded from all consequences and a scapegoat who is expected to carry the heavy financial and emotional burdens of the entire household. Rebecca spent her life trying to buy her mother's love by fixing their mistakes and hiding their massive debts. But she ultimately realized that enabling terrible behavior only breeds further entitlement. True healing often begins with a painful but necessary separation. Just like the emergency surgery that removed a physical infection from her body, Rebecca had to systematically remove the toxic individuals from her life to save her own future. She used her professional skills, her financial independence, and her unwavering boundaries to dismantle a lifetime of abuse. Her journey teaches us that walking away from abusive family members is not an act of cruelty. It is the ultimate act of self-preservation. You are not obligated to set yourself on fire just to keep your abusive family members warm. Have you ever found yourself playing the role of the silent provider for people who do not appreciate your sacrifices? It takes incredible courage to finally say enough is enough and close the door on lifelong manipulation. If you have ever had to set an iron boundary with a toxic relative, or if you are currently fighting to reclaim your own identity from a manipulative family system, I want to hear from you. Share your experiences in the comments below. Your story might be the exact inspiration someone else needs to finally stand up for themselves. Hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and remember that your peace of mind is entirely priceless.